Hello and welcome to the Inventorpreneur series. Inventorpreneur capture stories about inventors and those who are indirectly involved in taking the research product to the marketplace. Essentially, those who play an important role in the innovation ecosystem. Here, I indulge in conversation with faculties, patent professionals, and commercialization experts, and others in this entire supply chain. And today's episode is special to me. I'm excited to have my very good friend, Dr. Devanathan Raghunathan, as a part of this series. Devan did his PhD from University of Göttingen, Max Planck, uh, and got his did his postdoctoral fellowship from Singapore MIT Alliance and an industrial postdoc from A-Star Singapore. And interestingly, he also took a couple of detours from his research career uh, to do MBA from SB Jain School of Management and MTech at the National University of Singapore. Personally, I would say he's someone you can go to for career counseling. Uh, uh, and currently, he's a health and medtech lead at PwC Singapore. I've tried my best to give your background, Devan. Devan, welcome to the show. And could you please introduce yourself and your journey up until now, if I have missed anything?
Thanks so much, Venkat, for the warm introduction. Uh, I guess you've covered most of it. Perhaps I might just add that part of my learning is not just come from the degrees, but also working in exciting startups in academia and in government. So I think learning by studying and learning by doing together has helped me reach the current position where I'm helping. I'm part of the PwC Singapore Venture Hub, working with exciting medtech and health tech startups on their commercialization journey.
Devan, could you backtrack a bit and explain us about your background, your educational background, where you did your master's, uh,
Certainly.
and how it has shaped your research career?
Certainly. Well, of course, masters had the privilege of having Venkat as my classmate at IIT Madras, where I pursued a master's degree in chemistry. From there, I went on to the Max Planck Institute for Biophysical Chemistry in Göttingen, where I pursued a degree, PhD in chemistry, specifically focused on the applications of NMR spectroscopy for structural biology. And from there, I shifted gear, moved to a postdoc at K-Star in Singapore with a focus on bioinformatics and computational biology. Uh, Simultaneously, while I was there in Singapore at K-Star, I spent my evenings pursuing an MTech, a part-time MTech at the National University of Singapore, uh, and this was towards knowledge management and knowledge engineering. After that, I spent about 2 years at the Singapore MIT Alliance, and this was again a postdoctoral stint. But while I was doing this, I also pursued a MBA in finance at the SPJN School of Global Management in Singapore. Uh, Putting together all these things, degrees in computer science, finance, chemistry, I decided that the best way to leverage all the qualifications, but to apply them would be to jump into the deep end of the pool. And that's when I I joined startups in Singapore. So perhaps from about 2012 to 2017, I could perform various I took on various roles in the startup ecosystem here in Singapore, and I think that kind of rounded off my qualifications and experiences in the healthcare and life science domain.
Which that makes me wonder, Deva, like how did you manage your postdoctoral stint and in parallel you tried to pursue your MTech? I'm sure that must have been really taxing, right?
Well, I guess two things helped. One is curiosity, and the other is a supporting family. So not necessarily in that order. I would put the supporting family first. So I had the support of the family that I could spend the evenings in at the university taking lectures in various different subjects ranging from computer science, data analytics, and also intellectual property, entrepreneurship, etc. That was a very exciting time, and it was my first foray of looking beyond pure courses in pure chemistry, and that kind of opened up my eyes towards uh, the other subjects. What else is required to make a successful product or a successful company? So it certainly was tough, but I also had a supportive boss who I convinced that whatever I learned as part of this, I could apply in my research as well, and that certainly was true. I could take some concepts regarding clustering, and back then data analytics was still more. It was still statistics. We wouldn't call it so data analytics, but I learned a lot, and I could apply that to my research, and also improved my research in the sense that I had before I did not have any formal grounding in computing, but now I try to develop good practices in my coding, etc., which definitely added more to my work's efficiency.
Yeah, Devan, maybe I would like to dissect at this point, and uh, can you tell us how each of these learnings help you to shape or focus on different areas of work? Maybe why don't we start with the kind of research problem you worked on during your PhD and postdoctoral? Maybe we can try to have a smooth transition from there to startups and every other area you've worked on.
Certainly. So during my PhD, my focus was on applying NMR spectroscopy to elucidate the structure for uh, nucleic acids and nucleic acid protein complexes, as well as uh, more complex complexes that also involved antibiotics for inhibiting these RNA, DNA, protein complexes. So, nucleic acids, particularly RNA, was notoriously difficult and still are notoriously difficult to study because they disintegrate easily. We have to be extremely careful in how we synthesize it. Max Planck provided, I had the privilege of working there, and it provided me an environment where I not only synthesized my target nucleic acids in the lab, I also labeled them, radio labeling them, taking them to the NMR spectrometer, acquiring various high dimensional spectroscopic data at high magnetic field strengths. So these were all great experiences back in at the Max Planck. But towards the end of my PhD, much of my focus was on the computational aspects. So now we have a lot of experimental data, but how do we put it together in simulating a structure? And so, as you might know, NMR offers you a indirect method of studying but a dynamic method of studying the structure of biomolecules. So, because I was dealing with a lot of data at that time itself, uh, and using algorithms, uh, annealing techniques, simulations, etc. So that got me more interested in high performance computing, programming, computational biology, even the genomics aspects, etc. So, towards the end of my PhD, I decided that my next stint as a postdoc would be focused more on the computing aspects and not pursue further experimental studies either in NMR or in the lab on nucleic acids. So that is what led me to Singapore, where I joined a lab at the Bioinformatics Institute, and I could work with a lot of experimentalists, but my position was focused on getting experimental data and making predictions and coming up with new structures, new theories, etc. And a particular focus when I moved to Singapore was on kinases and also on some energetics, ATPases enzymes.
So, what was a significant takeaway for you at this point of time with the PhD and postdoc done? What I mean, essentially, I'm getting to a point where what was the hunger there for you to go beyond the research labs and explore other aspects of add-ons to research, if I may call it so?
Sure. So, two things that struck me. One was that the amount of time that we spend on analyzing the data. There's a lot of data available, but we had to find ways of smoothing and making it more efficient to analyze the data. So that meant that I realized early on that being digitally savvy and being able to write my own codes and scripts in Python, and then Perl was also very popular, and later on doing statistical analysis in R, etc. And even R also had modules for biology specific research. I remember bioconductor or something. So I got convinced early on that beyond the skills of synthesizing nucleic acids or acquiring good spectra at the NMR spectrometer, I had to develop analytical skills. I had to develop tools and ability to code, make things easier, script my workflows, etc. So that was one thing that drove me towards acquiring these skills. And the other skill in particular was also in being able to communicate what you're doing. Scientific communication, much of it as a doctoral student and even as postdocs, you're focused on writing or aiming for the highest impact factor journals. You're communicating your results to peer-reviewed journals where you know that others would understand your research, what you're trying to say. But try saying the same things to people who do not work in the same domain, even when you're writing grants or you're trying to explain it to the general public. So that was another thing that I really focused on, trying to improve the communication skills. How can I communicate verbally and in a written manner, complex scientific things in a simplified manner, and to highlight the impact of our research. So these are the two things that I think, which I firmly believe, above and beyond the core research that we do as chemists or biologists, these two skills came in very handy for me. And I think there should be a focus for any aspiring researcher as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you are someone who would give more emphasis on communication. So can you throw us more light on what you mean by research communication and how different it is from communication that is in other domains?
Right. At the risk of making it too simplified, I think as researchers, we believe in formatting our citations. Our accesses have to be marked, and there's a lot of discipline and very templatized way of communicating when we publish our results to certain or any journal. They have a certain way. Even the fonts are decided, and we aspire to keep it at certain lengths. Some of them say that it has to be X thousand words. Some of them allow you to be much more elaborative, etc. So I think scientific communication is, an art in itself. No way undermining that. However, when you try to take these important findings and communicate them for commercialization purposes, that requires wearing an entirely new hat. You've got to talk about impact. You've got to uh, look into the future, gaze into the crystal ball and see what kind of impact this discovery of yours or invention of yours would have on a larger population. Does it save lives? Does it save money? Does it shorten time, help you do some things quicker? So you've essentially got to start thinking in dollar and time values. So the communicating such ideas is drastically different from communicating it to scientific journals.
So essentially, what you're saying is that one has to be aware about the market needs, the market demand at the time of whatever research problem you're working on, and try to present it the way that how it would help the society to reap the benefits of your research.
Yes, market needs. Yes, that's a very broad term, but having spent the last maybe 8 or 10 years in this field of innovation, commercialization, etc., I find particularly in healthcare, you've got to narrow it down, coming up with a very pointed problem statement. I wouldn't even say market needs, but now I'm more focused on clinical needs. And what I do is early on engagement with clinicians and also patient focused groups, etc., but clinical needs. Most of the work that I do is centered around innovations in a clinical setting. So I find that while the execution work is done by scientists and engineers, but it is very critical for the doctor to define the problem, the clinician to say that this is the problem that we want to address. So market needs, bracket inverted commas, I say clinical needs.
Maybe this is the right time for us to segue into totally a different section of this conversation. Can you give us a broader overview of the pipeline from R&D to the marketplace, the stakeholders involved? Who are the major players involved in this, from the R&D setup to the market?
Interesting question, Venkat. And well, I started off in the pharma realm. Now I'm in the medical devices, and I particularly focus on software as a medical device, which is markedly different from the journey of a drug from bench to bedside. However, it's still complicated, perhaps a little shorter, but nevertheless makes for an interesting discussion. So let's start with thinking where the IP is generated. It's where I see sit. I usually see the IP generation at the universities or in labs such as national labs such as A-Star. But of course, such IPs would also come from the medtech companies. Also, they have active R&D programs, etc. So once the IP, and let's, for the sake of simplicity, just think of IP in terms of patent. But of course, IP is much broader. It can be know-hows, it can be copyrights, trademarks, anything else. But for the purpose of our discussion, we focus on my work, we focus a lot on patents. And we initially, from the business side, look at how interesting it would be to protect this as a patent and what's the market, the target market, etc. And that would be the basis of, so patents are pretty geographically geographic in nature. So we have to decide in which countries we would want to file the patents in, the national phase entries, etc. And it can be pretty expensive. So that's why we have to be very focused in our market entry upfront, where we think this patent should be filed. Moving ahead from patents, we will then start looking at validating our hypothesis. Whatever we've done is in a small, with some small samples, we got it to work. And now we want to gather real world evidence. And for this, we work with our clinical partners for clinical validation. And so that brings us to focus the light on another big partner in this journey, in this medtech journey, which are the clinicians and the hospital clusters, which help us with the clinical validation to show, something is effective and accurate, sensitive, specific as diagnostics, or to predict certain happenings. It's not just diagnosing diseases, but even predicting readmission rates, for instance, or reoccurrence. There are different things, but all of these things, we work on the regulated medical devices, so they need to be clinically validated. The data that we have now is now in a good position to put a team around it and see if we can now scale this, deploy this at scale. And we also now start thinking on the regulatory aspects. Which countries, every country has their own regulator. In Singapore, we have HSA. Of course, in the US, there's the FDA. In China, there's NMPA. So different countries have different regulatory needs. How do we have to present or prepare the dossier, etc. Get regulatory approval for our software as a medical device based on the risks that it carries. But just getting regulatory approval does not mean that it is commercialized yet. That's where a bigger challenge comes in. Now we have to figure out how to price it, who will pay for this service, who's the payer, will it be out of pocket expenses from the patient, do we have reimbursement from insurers, will the clinicians cost share it with us, etc. So all of these considerations come into play before the product is finally brought into market. So as you can imagine, there's so many stakeholders, right from engineers and scientists in the beginning to patent agents to the bodies like USPTO and IPOS in Singapore, which grant patents, and then the hospitals for clinical validation, the regulators, finally the payers, insurers, patients. So there are various stakeholders in this journey towards commercializing a medtech product.
Yes, Devan. Yeah, you power packed a lot of information here. Maybe I would like to branch off from here in different directions, especially about the regulatory aspects and clinical validation. Can you talk us through the IP generation process from university setup, startup setup, and from pharmaceutical company setup? How different they are?
I think the process in itself, the IP generation process or filing process is, for as I said, for this discussion, let's just focus on patents. The process itself is very similar. However, how many you file and how much you maintain would depend on how much money you have. For instance, let me talk about the university setting. Or any engineers or scientists usually think that, it comes with the field. Whatever we do, we think that it's all is very novel, everything's very inventive, very applied, etc. So we think that everything that we do is patentable many times. It's exciting research. Nevertheless, in universities, etc., now it's common to see that the tech transfer office works. There is a person on the patent side to examine it, and there's also a commercial side person who would examine it together and then come to a conclusion whether whether something is initially patentable or not. That means whether it ticks the boxes around novelty, inventive steps, and application. But then the business person chimes in with, what is a market opportunity if you do end up having a patent around such product or technology. Then questions come up with how quickly do you want to do it. Particularly interesting developments in Singapore was, patents that were around the AI deep tech space could be accelerated, could be sent for accelerated examination, etc. But nevertheless, the first step is always, whether you want to do a provisional filing just to get a priority, or you want to go ahead and file a fully drafted patent with all the claims, bells and whistles. Then it takes its own time before you do the national phase entry. I would just like to say that as startups particularly, but in general, when you're in the field, you realize that filing patents and then maintaining them, particularly if it's a sizable portfolio, can be very expensive. Several thousands, hundreds of thousands, and for universities and all, it can even be millions of dollars per year, the costs associated with filing as well as maintaining patents. So and I think that whether you are a startup, particularly if you're a startup, but across the field, whether you're a startup or whether you're a university or you're a tech company, a pharma company, you're always going to be very cost conscious and think a lot before filing patents.
And who pays for this? You mentioned that yes, there is a cost factor involved in maintaining a patent throughout the term of the patent. And who pays for this? Does it come from the grant money, from the funding you provide, the funding that was generated, or who pays for maintaining the patent or taking this product to the market?
So, I mean, the tech transfer office usually has a certain budget, to maintain patents, to file new patents, with the hope that in the next few years it would be able to successfully license these patents off to an interesting startup or companies who would want to license it, and pay the university or the startup sufficient money in order to justify the cost spent on patenting this. So it's got to be out of pocket, whether it's the university, the startup has to cough up its own money as well. So you would find most startups would not file their own patents, but they would be happier to work with the universities and other companies to in-license rather than having their own patents.
And just for the benefit of my listeners, tech transfer offices are intellectual property management cells in the university or academic institution setup to facilitate this transition from taking this research work and collaborate with the industrial partners or the law firms to have the legal document, the patent prepared, and help this transition from lab bench to the market. Devan, maybe I would like to probe further on this point, especially the early funding process, or they call it as seed funding. I understand that pharma setup, a pharmaceutical company, uh, that base is covered. Whereas for the startup or for the university setup, how do you generate funding? Who helps in funding this transition?
Uh, Thanks for the question, Venkat. Well, when we talk about funding, I work with startups a lot, and the initial, even before we talk about seed, a step before that itself is to rely on grants. Many of the times I see scientists and engineers from the universities who are spinning off. So university tends to have grants that such people can tap into to make a proof of concept of what they want to commercialize. uh, Once that is done through grants, and if they find that there is value, the concept is proved, they can license this off to their spin-off. Now comes a time when you look for angel funding. Even before you, seed is more more formal again, but funding is usually limited to friends, family, and I wouldn't say fools. That's a common joke. Friends, family, fools who put in the very early money. But this is extremely high risk capital, and people give it to you just because of because they know you and they want to support you. So this usually is a few thousand at max. 100K, etc. So this is just to get things started off as a company, right? After that, so the company takes the proof of concept and starts now working on proof of value. Is we've proved the concept, but now how do we prove the value? Is it going to be attractive and valuable for someone, particularly a formal investor, a venture capitalist, right? And so there are these very early stage VCs, and also there are even universities have investment cells in them. Some of them invest in return for equity, a share of your company, if they really believe in it. And so a typical seed round in uh, our field in medical device, etc., is anywhere between 3 to 5 million. But these things keep changing. We see monster seed rounds of tens of hundreds of millions as well. But typically they're about anywhere between a million to about a $5 million raise for a seed round. And they end up taking equity. These investors take equity in your startup, and that's what. And these people come in once they are convinced that you have either got regulatory approval or strong proof of value in different markets that you plan to enter, etc.
Can you talk us through the regulatory approval process, be it the pharmaceutical product or the medical devices? How different the regulatory approval process are against the products?
Yes, thanks, Venkat. The regulatory aspects of pharma and medtech have a lot in common, but they're also divergent on in many ways, particularly software as a medical device versus pharma. Pharma, as you might know, and which I wouldn't dwell too much on, is a more classic clinical trials. You've got phase two, phase three, etc. Medical device products, usually what happens is you are first looking at validation of you're looking at validation of the process and design, which usually means that whatever product that you have made or created, is it consistent? Does it produce the result consistently? And also, you also have to look at, is it confirming with the user needs and intended users? These are usually called process validation and design validation. Once these things are done, you move to clinical validation, which is a lot like pharma, but focused on showing clinical safety and efficacy first. And it totally depends on how big a sample cohort, patient cohort you are trialing this on, what is your threshold. And for regulatory purposes, one thing to consider is risk-based classification. What is the risk of using your software? Is it just something that is going to help the clinician take a decision, or is it going to drive the decision around treating the patient? Is it going to is the decision going to possibly result in a life and death situation, or is it not so much? So depending on that, there are various risk levels for the regulations. Finally, when you so the risk levels ties in with the intended use. What are you claiming? And based on that, you fall under different levels, different categories. Interesting thing is, there are pathways. Usually, FDA has well-defined pathways. If you find other predicate devices, existing devices in the market which does similar work as yours, then you can identify these devices as predicates and show substantial equivalence, that whatever you have made and invented and seeking regulatory approval for is substantially equivalent to the existing device. And that allows you to have an accelerated market entry. If your device is very novel, it may require you to do a much more thorough trial, which is called de novo, PMA, etc., which may take a much longer time for you to prove safety, efficacy, etc., without having any competitors and substantial equivalence. So yeah, there are differences and then there are similarities as well.
And I know it is hard to gauge and compare, but can you give us a rough time scale for the regulatory approval of, let's say, a pharmaceutical drug against a medical device? A rough time scale, lesser, more, or something along the lines.
In the experience that I've had, it's substantially lesser. Medical devices have been approved in a substantially lesser time than it takes for pharmaceutical, for new drugs, for instance. So I'm comparing absolutely new drugs and new molecular entities that are brought in. They may take years, 5 to 10 years to get through the complete clinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 before they are granted approval by bodies such as FDA. However, medical devices, once you start off on the regulatory processes, I have found that usually they get it within a year or two. even sooner.
Devan, having given us some bird's eye view on the uh, regulatory aspects involved for the pharma and the medical devices, can you give us a broader overview of the role of clinicians, scientists, and commercialization experts?
Sure, Venkat. So earlier on, I think the roles of the engineers and scientists end up working with regulatory experts uh, to work on quality management systems for process validation, design validation, etc. Then the next stage is to work with clinicians at the hospitals to put in place. So I'm assuming that we are going to do a clinical trial for clinical validation. So this requires putting in a proper clinical protocol, getting this across through a institutional review board, and finally the clinician has to work with you for the clinical validation bit. And then, once all these results are collated into a dossier submitted for regulatory approval, you you would get so what I would really like to highlight is, even if something is receives regulatory approval, a product or a device, it does not mean that it is commercializable. There are a lot of examples of products that are approved, but they failed at commercializing it. So it's interesting for the role of the business person to come in, put a business plan around it, and there's a lot of intricacies over here to find out, around health economics, who would pay, how much they would pay, are there reimbursement codes available, is it something that a patient would pay out of pocket? Would it be sold to the hospital or over the counter directly to patients, etc.? So it's a nice continuum where each one of the stakeholders that you mentioned has a very strong role to play. Engineers, scientists, regulatory specialists, clinicians, and finally the business people as well.
Devan, since you're working in the medical devices domain, can you, of course, I don't expect you to reveal everything that you're working on, but can you just give us some sense of what are the exciting innovations that we can look for that's going to come out in the market maybe 5 years down in the medical device system?
Well, again, this is all speculative, but I can say from my own interests and news that I follow, I believe that the medical devices can target some very big problems that are currently being treated with drugs. Let's take an example like diabetes. I believe that within the next 5-7 years, we should be able to see a device and implant artificial pancreas that should be able to solve the huge diabetic problem, type 1 and type 2, presently, and particularly in Asians. Other developments that I would say is something like a total artificial heart, that people that don't have to wait for donors to get heart transplants, etc. So I think these are extremely invasive and device oriented things that I think are would be there in the next 5 to 10 years. Definitely these things would be a reality. Of course, a lot of them are already being trialed. From the software side, I believe we are getting closer. There are already a lot of examples of software as medical device using AI, machine learning methods to help doctors diagnose early, but also beyond the hospital, at home, to predict if somebody is going to get sick in advance and prevent readmissions or coming into the hospitals. So these are all exciting things that are already in place, and I think they'll become more commonplace. More and more hospitals, more and more doctors would want to adopt these things. I believe the future is about doctors. These tools are not going to replace doctors, but these are going to assist doctors in providing better care to patients. Robotic surgeries and other domain that I follow very closely. So these are some of the things that I remain very excited about in the medical device space.
Exciting times ahead, Devan. I really look forward for all of this. Maybe at this point, I'd like to zoom out a bit and ask you about uh, what do you tell a prospective PhD grad about a non-traditional research career?
I believe it's a nice question, Venkat, but I believe the lines between traditional and non-traditional research are already blurring a lot. What we thought of research and commercialization outside of the ivory tower as non-traditional is something that is keenly being taken up by universities themselves. There's a lot of even companies that are not satisfied with their existing products. They want to create intrapreneurial ventures, encouraging their own workers, their own employees to think about new products and services that they can commercialize. Similarly, every university now, particularly the technology departments, science and engineering, etc., they are not only judged by the high impact papers that they publish, but how many spin-offs they have, university spin-offs, how many raised venture capital, how many of these spin-offs went on to employ more people, creating jobs, having economic value add to the country, to the society. So in light of that, I think what I would like to tell aspiring graduate students, particularly in the science and engineering disciplines or even medical disciplines, what, what I would say is a takeaway for me is you would always be doing exciting science wherever you are. You would I hope you would choose novel, interesting problems to solve. But while you're doing that, also think of novel, interesting ways to communicate the impact of your research, not just to your peers, your colleagues, or your superiors in the university, but to people outside. Talk about it, communicate, share it with enthusiasm to show what you're doing is, going to make a difference to society. I think for far too long, many of us, just spend time in the lab and are chasing high impact papers. It's changed a lot now. There are associations, postdoc associations, graduate student associations, where you discuss beyond research, beyond literature, scientific literature. You think about how to commercialize, who will be your investors, who will be your founders, co-founders, etc. So I think that's an important aspect that I would like to highlight. And the other point also is something that I benefited is be multi-skilled or multidisciplinary, and try to be digitally very savvy. Analytics, scripting, basic programming, being strong with your statistics. These are things that I think should go be a default now. And there is no excuse. There's too much of material out there for you to access and train yourself in.
Right. Rightly said, Devan. Multidisciplinary is the catchword there. Go beyond the boundaries of your lab bench and explore. Devan, usually I pose this question to all my guests. So, given a chance that you're given a provision to go back in time, what do you tell younger Devan?
Um, that's a nice way to end the interview, Venkat. Looking back, I think I did several steps in sequence. Studying, looking at computing and analytics after I finished my PhD, and then looking at business management, finance, etc. subsequently. So but interestingly, now I find a lot of colleagues and I meet a lot of students who are able to juggle all of these things in parallel while they are doing their research. I met a couple of people who are doing they are in life sciences, but they are finishing their CFA, which is a quite a tough examination to clear for corporate finance analysis. I see universities now offering very interesting combinations: a PhD with a MD or JD. There are graduate schools that allow people to take courses in the law school as well. Masters of public health along with research in life sciences. So even universities are now offering a lot of these courses that complement. It's not just focused on the research bit, but you can take courses in other parts of other departments as well, and take other complementary degrees too. So I think if I were to talk to my younger self, and if I had a chance to revisit that, I would want to do a lot more things in parallel rather than in sequence. But I'm kind of happy the way things have worked out as well. There's no regrets, and if not by a process of deduction, but by a process of elimination, I have found the sweet spot where I feel curious, where I feel content, and I feel happy doing the work that I'm doing right now.
With that note, Devan, I'll join my listeners in wishing you well in all the endeavors that you are pursuing. So, wishing you good luck and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Venkat. Pleasure talking to you. Bye.